Good morning. This is just a very short video to introduce our next unit, the individual and society. Questions concerning individual rights and social responsibilities have really been at the core of the American experience since its inception. And of course, as students of history and American citizens, you already have some exposure to this concept, the whole idea of personal freedom and personal liberty. And when you think about our history and we think about what freedoms and what liberties that individuals desired, which ones attracted those people to come to America? And of course, we can think about things like the freedom to practice religion, the notion of a free an open society. These things still attract people to America. The whole notion that here in America you can recreate yourself, and if you work hard and you're industrious, that you can rise, what's sometimes referred to as upward social mobility. And of course, back in the early 17th century, 18th century, these liberties really weren't as prevalent in other places of the world, most notably England and Europe. But of course, with personal freedoms comes some level of responsibility too. In other words, what types of social contracts become necessary for a group of people who are living together? And we've already seen glimpses of that. For example, the Mayflower Compact in William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. Another nagging question is, how should conflicts between duty to ourselves and responsibility to others be resolved? This is a question that some of the texts in this unit will explore. The idea of the individual and his or her influence over society. How much or to what extent can one person, can an individual influence or alter prevailing notions in a dominant society? So questions of this sort reverberate through the pages of American culture and will become our primary interest in our selected readings over the next few weeks. So let's talk a little bit about conflict as a concept. And of course, our usual immediate reaction to the term conflict, or certainly when we experience conflict in our lives, is that it's a negative thing, right? But at the core of our reading in this unit, we will be identifying and discussing conflict, which is the struggle that grows out of two opposing forces in a plot. Conflict in literature, and in life, really, always provides a certain level of interest, a certain amount of suspense, and certainly tension. At least one of the opposing forces is usually a person when you think about traditional fiction, traditional literature. And the person who is usually experiencing that conflict is known as the protagonist. So we have conflict, and usually the person experiencing it is known as the protagonist. And without conflict, there is no suspense. And suspense can be defined as the quality which makes us want to continue reading to see the outcome of the events, and how the outcome ultimately affects the protagonist. So with no conflict, there really is no suspense, and thus there is no story. And so at the heart of every good story, any story that usually intrigues us as readers or viewers of movies, if we think about it in those terms, at the core of every story, there has to be a conflict. Because if there is no conflict, there is no suspense. And if there's no suspense, there's nothing that or there's nothing that entices you to keep reading or keep viewing a movie, if that were the case. In literature, as in life, conflicts can take on one or a multitude of different forms, and the most common of which I've listed here for you. we can, as human beings, come into conflict with nature. And of course, we don't have to think or look too far to see examples of that, correct? I mean, in the region where we live, we experience tornadoes. We've recently seen a series of hurricanes come through. We've seen earthquakes. And so anytime that an individual comes up against or encounters conflict with nature, it's usually usually a pretty interesting story to be told, because it's very, very difficult, as we've seen, for individuals to overcome the powers of the natural world. Another kind of conflict is a struggle against another person. So person versus person. You get into an argument with a supervisor at work, or you get in conflict with your brother or your sister or your boyfriend or girlfriend. So this is the nature of the conflict. The two opposing forces are two different people, or in the case of literature, two different characters. And each character may have a certain agenda or desire, and those conflicts, when they clash, or those desires when they clash between two people, create a conflict, and we like to watch those play out. Another type of conflict is a struggle within a person. So, in other words, you have an internal conflict. These are usually not physical ones. These are usually conflicts that are matters of conscience. So you're wrestling with a decision. Do I speak out? Do I stand up against something that I see or perceive as being an injustice? It can be something as simple as, do I eat the last bit of the ice cream while the rest of my family is sleeping, instead of letting everybody share it? But I mean, that's just an example. That would never really happen in real life. And then finally, we have the individual who is in conflict or struggling against society. And here's a great slide of Dr. Calatrello there, always on the outside, looking in, or in this case, looking out. But all kidding aside, how many of us, I think we've all felt at some point in our lives as though, we're not in step with what the larger society expects of us or wants of us, and that somehow we don't fit in, and that we're feeling pressure to conform to a particular a way of thinking or a particular way of life, and so these are the types of conflicts that we're going to be exploring in this unit, which to me I think are usually some of the most fascinating kinds of conflicts to explore, are those that deal with individuals who are facing incredible pressures to somehow change, or being asked to conform to a larger society, and what does that look like, and how does that protagonist cope or deal with the various pressures that society can place on its members. Okay, here I've got a few tips to pass along to you to help your critical reading skills as we go through these texts in this unit. Always pay close attention to the protagonist in the story, or the speaker. If what we are reading is a poem, what does he or she seem to value? Does the protagonist or the speaker seem to be living his or her life in a certain way? Is there a certain code by which the person seems to be living? And when you see textual clues of this nature, you always want to identify them. You want to underline them, mark them in your text, because of course this will help you when it comes time to write our next exam. And pay special attention and take close notice of any particular actions that the character takes. that seem to reveal the conflict, any conversations that take place between or among characters, and what other characters, or it may even be a narrator in the story, reveal to us about the protagonist. Okay, because this is ultimately how we begin to form a picture of a character, or of the people we meet, isn't it? We watch them. We think about real life. I mean, if literature is good, and artistically sound, it should be giving us some reflection of the lives that we live. And if you think about the way you get to know people, you observe them, you watch their actions, you watch what they say, you watch how they treat people, you watch how other people react to that person, and all of this works cumulatively for us to begin to form an opinion, right, about an opinion about a person. Pay special attention to the protagonist or the speaker as he or she becomes conflicted. What precipitates it? In other words, what brings the conflict about? Is there a certain series of events that triggers the character's conflict? And when you come across those instances, identify them in your text by underlining or marking them. Again, this is all in an effort to help you be more proficient and efficient as you prepare for the exam. Take a look at the setting and the situation that you find the protagonist, and how does the setting of a particular story seem to be affecting the individual. Because even though, as I said a few slides ago, that we have there are these various types of conflict, the reality is that they often overlap one another. So you can have a character whose physical setting, the environment, is causing him or her hardship, but the character could also be wrestling about internally with what to do as a result of that. Pay special attention to how the protagonist interacts with other characters, for they may represent society and its values. So this is kind of an interesting point here. So, because sometimes that's what authors will do. They will use characters in their stories, right, to represent larger, sort of more abstract ideas. And so we will see instances where certain characters in stories represent, I mean, they're certainly functioning as individual characters, but they seem to be representing something else, some larger prevailing concept of society. And so when it's quite interesting then to see the individual as he interacts with a character who, by his nature, seems fated to be in conflict with the protagonist. Always, and this is probably the most important thing we can think about with this slide, and certainly in this unit. It's one of the most intriguing aspects of approaching literature this way thematically, and particularly with this theme. Always identify what happens to the protagonist. Is he or she destroyed? And destruction and death can take various forms, can't it? I mean, you can obviously be physically killed and destroyed, and sometimes that happens with characters when they come into severe conflict with either themselves, another person, or the natural world. But also, the deaths or the destruction can figure more symbolically, and they can be in other words, the characters can experience spiritual deaths or psychological deaths. Even though they're physically still alive, they have been fundamentally changed and defeated by the conflict that they have been through. And then the third and equally interesting outcome, I guess, of a character is that they can just leave. They can flee. The conflict becomes too much, and they physically flee the setting or the conflict. And this happens all the time in American literature. At the end of Huck Finn, Huck can't stand society anymore, and so he lights out for the territory, the open West. I mean, you think about all of Melville's characters who take to the sea. Well, heck, just think of Napoleon Dynamite, if you remember that movie. When things get too crazy for Napoleon, he just sort of runs away. And so this is another thing you'll see these characters do. They just physically move away. They flee. They run away from it. And so these are just a few questions that, if we were in class together, we would discuss. But some things to think about. Some questions. What does society expect of its individuals? What happens to the individual who does not meet the expectations of his or her society? What options are available to the individual in conflict with his or her society? And finally, our society and its institutions, large things like education, religion, government, etc., are they inherently good or evil? So these are some questions to have floating around in your head for the next few weeks, and as we encounter our next selections and authors. I look forward to seeing you soon. Hope you guys have a great day.